My name is Patsy Horton and I am the programmer here. And as I say, you're very welcome to this, our first lunchtime event of 2024, a conversation around a recently published book, Irish Women's Prison Writing, Mother Ireland's Rebels, 1960s to 2010s. And this is the book here, and it is it's very expensive to buy, but there is a copy here in the Living Hall, so if you're interested in reading it or for research purposes, we have it here. This book explores, is by Red Washburn, who is on my right here, and it explores 50 years of Irish women's prison writing, connecting the work of women leaders and writers, and it brings in a whole range of sources to tell that story of Irish women's prison writing and in the period, personal correspondence, autobiographies, biographies, narratives, poetry. And it's a book that puts women's voices centre stage, making sure that their lives, actions and stories are documented and represented. As I say, I'm delighted that Red is here with us today, and I'm also delighted that a significant amount of the research that went into the book was done here in the Linen Hall and drew on our archives here. So that is, it's great to know that that the material here is being used so well. You'll see we have 4 speakers here today, and they're going to together they're going to give us a brilliant sense of the territory that the book covers, and also allow us to hear firsthand some of those voices through poetry and memoir. As I say, I just move along, and this is the order in which they will appear when I leave the stage. So Red Washburn is first, and then the writer Roseleen Walsh, and scholar and writer Eilish Rooney, and then researcher and soon to be completing her PhD, Susie Deedigan. As I say, they're going to speak in that order, and I'm going to introduce them to you now so that I am not popping up and down through the event, and there'll be time at the end for some questions. So as I say, I'm delighted to have Red with us today, and he is based in the English and Women's and Gender Studies at Queen's College at the City University of New York. They're an affiliate faculty in Women's and Gender Studies at the Graduate Centre, and say this is his latest book, and it's published by Routledge. Also then I have Roseleen Walsh, who began her literary journey in Armagh prison, where she was interned for 13 months and 2 weeks across 1973 to 4. She began writing poetry on her cell walls and ceiling, and at home now, more than 50 years later, 2 of her living room walls are covered in her poetry. So she's the author of poetry collections, poetry monologues, short stories. She's written approximately 40 plays, so incredibly prolific. And today she's going to be reading to us and talking to us about her memoir in progress, My Internment. And then we have Eilish Rooney, who is Emeritus Scholar in the School of Applied and Social Policy Sciences at the Transitional Justice Institute, in the School of Law at the University of Ulster, and she's taught in a whole range of places, including the Ulster People's College, and she joined Ulster University as a lecturer in community studies back in the 80s, and then the Transitional Justice Institute in 2006. She's also a Transitional Justice Institute representative on the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and she's going to be reading to us today from a collection of poems, Ballymurphy poems. And as I say, Susie Deedigan is a final year PhD student at Queen's University, and her doctoral project is the first comprehensive study of female political imprisonment and state responses to female subversion in Ireland during the Second World War. And she also works in the Maclean Library's Special Collections and Archives Department, and is currently teaching Irish history at QUB as well. So we have a huge range of experience on the stage and a variety of voices, and I'm just really looking forward to the discussion today, and to hearing more about the book and to enjoying the memoir and poetry and getting the context for all of that. So I'd like to invite Red first of all, and I say each speaker will appear in turn. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the intro, Patsy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before I begin, I really want to thank the Linden Hall for hosting this talk. As Patsy said, a lot of the research in my book here was done at the Linden Hall, and it's just been such a welcoming, intellectually stimulating, and just very fun space for me. So I'm really delighted to be here and share with you all at the Linden Hall Library. I also want to thank Patsy and Áine for helping organize this event, and thank Roseleen and Eilish and Susie for being here in conversation and for their work as well. So to begin, I want to note that part of this talk is a larger discussion of women political prisoners, but for today's purposes, there's a short window, so I'm going to be focusing on Eileen Hickey's work. And Eileen Hickey was the officer in command at Armagh, which I argue is a continuation of her activism, and her writing serves as a part of that activism. I first began with a biographical overview of her and then turn to thematic and stylistic analyses in her writing. And that includes letters, statements, petitions, tributes, and speeches. And I should say that the book does, I think, like a fair balance of looking at more notable, prestigious writers, people who have been kind of in the center, and then people who have been kind of on the margins. And I would argue that Eileen Hickey has not necessarily gotten the scholarly praise that she should have gotten for her work. So I'm highlighting her work today as part of that. And the book is very much a historical and literary project. So I'm looking at both historical and literary themes in the work. So her writing, I argue, is a form of collective action. And I look at the uses of humor, irony, shout-outs, roll calls, thank yous, and allusions in her writing. And this talk is going to explore the intersections of feminism and republicanism in the north of Ireland through the pen and eyes of Eileen Hickey, as well as focus on specific themes of leadership and comradeship in her work, particularly the anthology that she worked on called In the Footsteps of Anne, Stories of Republican Women, that was later finished and edited by Evelyn Brady, Eva Patterson, Kate McKinney, Rosie Hamill, and Pauline Jackson, which Roseleen actually gave to me before I had the ability to get it myself. Overall, I argue that Hickey's writing shows a different view of history, struggle, and canon. So to start with, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Hickey's life. Eileen Hickey was born September 3rd, 1948. She was arrested for possession of a weapon and ammunition in January 1973. Her arrest occurred alongside other volunteers when they were moving a weapon from the Clonard area for volunteers. She was later charged with intent to endanger life, arguably, and that was added for retaliation for refusing to recognize the court. In her essay, Armagh Jail 1973, which is here, she discusses the details of her arrest, and I'm quoting here, "My name is Eileen Hickey. I was 23 years old, and I was arrested and sentenced to 9 years in Armagh Jail. Myself and Marie were both volunteers. We worked for the battalion staff and also helped out for Unit D Company." She explains it was safer for women to transport arms, and she argues that this was a sexist practice that is often relegated to women who are falsely perceived as peaceful to avoid searches. She explains that they ordered us at gunpoint and they put us against the wall, I'm quoting here. "They questioned us off and on all day, but we never gave an inch." In addition to not answering their questions, she refused to recognize the court, as I noted earlier, and as a result, her trial was over very quickly. She was then sent to Armagh. Armagh became her home, and it felt like home to her there. And she says, quote, "I felt a great sense of relief when the gates of the A wing were open, and for the first time in days, I was met with friendly faces. These were the Republican prisoners I knew. Some of them I didn't know, and some I grew to know very well. There was always plenty of crack among the women and a good laugh that we shared." She was the officer in command from 1973 to 1977, thereby holding a leadership position still committed to the Irish freedom struggle in prison. Republicans formed the A Company to create solidarity and resistance to persecution from prison officers, thereby creating their own structure within the prison, with the OC in charge of organizing and advocating for Republican women. Hickey established and proudly held the first leadership position there. Given much respect and admiration, she was known for her quote-unquote strong leadership, with even, quote, the screws totally giving up because the political prisoners only took, quote, at quarters from Eileen Hickey. In 1977, at 27, she was released on half a mission. When released, she shifted her activism to writing and archiving. In particular, she dedicated her life to creating two new projects, the first of which was the anthology I mentioned, and the latter of which was the Irish Republican History Museum, which you should all visit if you haven't already done so. The museum is now an invaluable contribution to the struggle and the memory of it. As stated on its brochure for its visitors, it contains numerous artifacts from medals from the rebellions of 1798 and 1803, medals from 1916 to 1923, and from prison handicrafts during the Troubles. Its mission is to, quote, to preserve and promote the art, crafts, and artifacts, the history of the Republican struggle for Irish freedom, for Republican history to be told by Republicans, to educate so that our youth may understand why Republicans fought, died, and spent so many years in prison for their beliefs. This was Hickey's vision. She was dedicated to educating youth about the struggle for Irish freedom. She taught many courses at the Conway Mill Center, and in addition, she opened the museum to expand this historical learning. However, she got cancer, and before she could finish her project, she unfortunately died on February 2nd, 2006. Her friends finished her project in her honor. I discuss her anthology as a form of leadership and activism later in this talk, and again, I draw from archival materials that were housed here at the Lynn Hall. So at this point, I'm going to look at some thematic and stylistic components of her work, particularly focusing on themes of leadership and comradeship. And these, again, are coming from her prison prose. The refusal to align political status to political prisoners was one of the salient forms of dehumanization used for Republican women prisoners of war. Hickey addresses the conditions before special category status as follows, and I'm quoting here. Women had to wear prison uniforms and were forced to serve their time with ordinary criminals. Women were only entitled to one visit and one parcel per month. As most women had young families, they fretted and worried about their children. This disrespect was problematic for prisoners who were interned as a result of colonialism. As OC, Eileen Hickey fought these policies, leading her comrades into resistance in a new form. She provides an example of the ways in which Republican women subverted power dynamics to these unjust rules and regulations as follows. They used to threaten us ordinary prisoners into submission, but we, the Republican prisoners, had our own way of standing up to them. One example of this is that he expected us to stand at attention when he entered the wing. The Republican women stood together and refused to do this. We would either sit down or we put our hands in our pockets. And that's the end of that quote. This is an example of insubordination that resulted in additional forms of punishment for Hickey and other comrades, but Republican women chose to suffer on protest rather than giving up their rights. In fact, women were proud of their political commitments, honored them, and maintained their rebellious spirits by organizing parades. And that's resistance too. Hickey documents her experiences on Easter, for instance. She shares the following, and I'm quoting, this is from her writing. Like Republicans all over Ireland, we too paraded in honor of our patriot dead. We remembered with pride the volunteers of 1916, and in our own time, our own fallen comrades. Every Republican prisoner marched in full uniform. You're able to get in black shirts and sweaters and our parcels. We crocheted our black berets, and Easter lilies were smuggled in during our visits. The flags were the hardest to acquire, but we managed them with the expertise of those handy with a sewing machine, and artists were able to draw out the patterns of the emblems on the flags. Eventually, we had the full color party, and we were able to honor our dead. The dance, the songs, and the crack were always good, but the sense of achievement we felt was always the best. We were all in Armagh for the same cause, Ireland's freedom, and that gave us the strength and unity we all needed. In this passage, Hickey uses vivid imagery. She allows readers to learn about how they all participated through vicarious ways by putting us in a position to witness the parades in historically rich ways. It's also important to note that these Republican women were severely disciplined for such contraband activities, including smuggling in clothes and flags, on top of openly proclaiming their wish for an Irish Socialist Republic while in prison. They marched, sang songs of 1916, and sang the national anthem in defiance and with pride, as opposed to wearing prison uniforms and doing tedious work. Their joy was also a form of resistance. Hickey's leadership demonstrates her pride not only in herself, but in her comrades by sharing such creative accounts. Hickey employed what I call shout-outs in her writing. They functioned as an extension of her leadership, an accurate account and archive of it, and relentless commitment to comradeship. Ranging from historical heroes like Devlin, Drum, and the men in the H blocks, Hickey writes about a plethora of comrades and uses political allusion as well in her writing. She includes the first political prisoner McKee and her generous birthday salad sandwiches for Holland on her 18th, Kennedy, who had 6 children, and her sister Eibhlín, who had 2 children, and the repression they experienced as mothers in prison, and McConnell, a mother of 6 children and 3 grandchildren, who was targeted by the British government because, quote, their fear of Republican women was so great that they even interned a grandmother. And of course, Father Murray, whose untiring sympathy, help, kindness, and care, quote, eased our plight through the years of imprisonment. In addition, Hickey addresses bereavement using a technique of shout-outs. She calls out to Doyle, to Drum, to Crawford, to Perry, to the Price sisters, to Colette, to Áine, and those are just a few. Along with Father Murray, Hickey was there for the women who lost loved ones while in prison, always extending a hand and offering empathy. She writes as follows, and I'm quoting, "Death of a loved one was the greatest heartache of all. Father Murray's quiet-spoken words and sensitivity were a great help in these times of immense grief and sorrow. Everyone was affected. The usual noise of everyday life in prison became muted. The girls spoke in low voices. A sense of helplessness crept through the prison. In this passage, Hickey illustrates her deft leadership skills, and they resonate in her love for the women who are grieving. She uses personification and silence to illustrate the presence of absence. In this way, she reimagines grief as a collective mourning, not feeling completely alone in prison. She even dedicates her writing to deceased women. As she puts it in her essay, Liberty and Strength, the A Company Arma, which is also here, I salute to the memory of those brave women who knew in Arma, who I knew in Arma, and who have since died. By extension, her comrades did the same for her. They finished the book in her honor. And I would argue that this is her last form of cultural and political activism. They gave her, Eileen Hickey herself, an actual shout out in the book. For instance, Eva Patterson, one of the editors of the book, says, quote, I always looked up to Eileen Hickey, whom she called, quote, a genuine woman and, quote, a very dedicated Republican. Drum discusses that Eileen was with her when her mother died and wrote the oration when she could not, and she says, quote, she was very good to me. Nellis remarks, quote, Eileen was always there for us, and that is why so many women arguably contributed to anthologizing their stories in this, quote, book of Eileen Hickey's, in O'Hagan's words, even though they wanted to put their lives in prison behind them and not relive their trauma. Lastly, and arguably the most memorable form of leadership and comradeship is the anthology itself, what I like to think of as a collective shout out and a tribute to Republican women ex-prisoners, their work, their lives, and in their own words. The archive, along with the museum, is perhaps the most generous and collective form of memory, appreciation, and resistance to date. More than 10 years of work, Eileen Hickey states, quote, the book is a testament to the events and the experiences of Republican prisoners during the period known as the Troubles. Contextualizing the project, the editors reveal, quote, it was Eileen Hickey's hope for this book, containing the stories of Republican women, that we would in some way recognize the contribution of the women and fight for a 32-county socialist republic to ensure that they are not written out of history. She worked tirelessly by putting ads in newspapers for this collective anthology. Indeed, it serves as a prison archive of truth-telling for, by, and about the women themselves. Hickey states, the book could have been written a long time ago, but it would not have come from the women who experienced arrests, interrogations, beatings, and eventual imprisonment at the hands of the RUC and the British Army. These stories have to be told for the sake of Republican history. Many women were killed in action and their names are enshrined forever on the Roll of Honor. Her leadership was infused and practiced in her life very organically, both inside and on the outside. As the editors note, quote, Eileen's caring, protective role as officer in command of Army did not stop when she was released. She was well aware of the issues facing women on the outside. Anyone who knew her would agree that she was always there to listen and help. She truly had our best interests at heart. Furthermore, giving back to Hickey a circular and karmic shout out for her life and work, they finished this project, and I would argue saw her death as a form of a collective thank you for her life and her work. In the introduction, the editors decided that, quote, in memory of Eileen, we would try our best to make this book a reality, which they eventually did in 2011, just 5 years after her death. They also admit that upon Hickey's death, more women were willing to put their lives and their stories out there for Hickey. They write, quote, they remembered a young and very courageous woman who always stood up to the might of the prison establishment, always protecting prisoners' rights, their welfare, and their emotional well-being. There could never be a greater tribute to Eileen Hickey than the resolve of the woman to finish her own project which she started. Hickey's leadership and comradeship deepened after her death by the passing on the torch to the other women who passed it back to her. Her leadership skills in writing and archiving are truly remarkable and wonderful. And to conclude, I want to argue again that Hickey's life and work emphasized the political urgency of knowing history, resisting power, and fighting for Irish freedom. Her writing is a testament to the power of women's resistance, and her words demonstrate that the revolution was stylized. Her words shaped the struggle in captivating ways just as much as her involvement was central to it. And again, I want to thank everyone here for listening to the talk, and I have additional talks also coming up at Queen's University Belfast on January 22nd and 23rd about other writers in the project, so I'd love to see you there. If you want more information, you can look at my website, which is redwashburn.com, and I'm going to pass it on to Roseleen. I'm really excited that everyone is here in conversation with me.
Before I read the chapter out of the book, My Interment, I want to read a poem. I wrote this poem after Crumlin Road was emptied of prisoners, and everybody that went up to the Crum, everybody wanted to see the tunnel where you walked from the prison over to be sentenced. The tunnel. Some have argued that there was choice, but after the first thought of the injustice, after the first stone thrown, there was no going back. Now, 40 years later, I have survived, reached manhood, unlike many, I know, and I stand at the entrance to the tunnel that sent thousands to an unkind, unforgiving place. I stand where too many stood, but now I have choice. I can go home. I can live in peace because I am part of that peace. So this is the second chapter in the book, and it's titled Settling In. I awoke as the key turned. The door opened slowly. Its hinges needed oil. I did not dare look to see who was standing in the doorway. Then I heard the clatter of footsteps that were to become so familiar. They moved along, and once more the rattle and the turning of the key into the next cell. I gently pulled the bed sheet back and stepped out into my shoes. I was still dressed from the weekend, and my hair was a tangled mess. Cautiously, I made my way across the large stone floor to the toilets, where I met Mary Dillon brushing her teeth at one of 4 sinks. I heard you being brought in last night, but it was too late. I didn't want to shout up to introduce myself. I'm Mary Dillon, and I'm from Clonard. What about you? Roseleen Walsh, Anderson's time. What happened to you? Interned? Have you any clothes or anything in with you? No, I said. She told me when I had finished to go over to cell number 4 for breakfast. It was Mary McGuigan's cell. Mary was smoking and drinking tea, wearing a floral housecoat. She had a few rollers in her hair, preparing for her weekly remand appearance in the court that morning. Handing me a china cup, she asked how many sugars I took. We shook hands and searched one another's eyes for that recognition of comradeship. We found it and smiled. At last, I felt that I was among friends, as Mary told me she knew my parents well. An excitement grew within me as Mary Dillon led me upstairs to the sentenced wing where the internees were housed. I would be meeting others that beforehand I had only either heard of or read in the newspaper about. My day was beginning to look up. The first person I recognised was Susan Lochran from the New Lodge Road. She looked just like her picture in the Republican News when she got engaged to Peter Rogers, a friend of both my brothers. Then Susie, she was a senior screw in her 40s or maybe early 50s, I thought. She came straight over to me and informed me that the governor, Mr. Cunningham, would like to have a word with me at some point that morning. I acknowledged the information with a nod of the head. I was having more tea and toast standing around the super sir on the class, which in fact were floored sheets of thick panelling that blocked out the downstairs wing from the upstairs wing. Usually in prisons, the landings have protective netting between each level for safety precautions. But in Armagh, the sheeting also reinforced the fact that upstairs was a political wing for Republican political prisoners. Downstairs was for all remands, regardless. The super sir was the main source for toasting bread and a vocal point for informal gatherings, usually before lockup. Eileen Hickey, the OC of A Company, came out from her cell and greeted me with a handshake. In 1973, hugs and kisses had not yet arrived in Ireland as a way of greeting. I learned that there was a formal command structure in the prison. Eileen, the OC, had a loyal adjutant in Mary Dillon, also in the TO, the QM and the IO, and several other prisoners who had authority in their own department. As I recall, Kate McKinney was over the arts and crafts that were done for the Prisoners' Defendants Fund. It was through Kate that I learned to knit iron jumpers. At exactly 10 a.m, everyone stood outside their cell and the TO, training officer, gave an order in Irish to stand to attention, then at ease, and from the bottom of the wing and around the other side, the OC entered each cell to inspect that it was clean and tidy. After inspection, the TO would call out an order for everyone to fall out, which was to go back to doing whatever they intended. The inspection was vital for everyone. It meant discipline and cleanliness. It also meant that you had to get out of bed early, have breakfast and clean. In hindsight, it was also important for mental well-being, and it meant the prisoners ran the wing, not the screws. I was escorted down to meet the governor, Mr. Cunningham, a respectful man and a good role model for any modern prison administration that sought to help and not estrange the inmates under its care. Now, almost 47 years after that meeting, I do not recall a single word he spoke, but I do remember him as a good human being that morning. Finally, he instructed Big Susie to bring me up and show me my cell. It was at the very end of the wing and next door to Rush McCotter, cell number 1. The cell obviously had not been occupied in a long time. Susie, the screw, unlocked the door, and there before me was not a mess but a blank canvas. Immediately, I knew white walls would suit me best, for I intended making those walls a work of art. I would surround myself with the comfort of my own words. Since I was young, I would find it hard to express myself to others, so I found poetry a wonderful way of saying what I meant. I learned that others did not necessarily see beauty in the same way as I did. For example, I used to think that straw was beautiful. It was straight, thick, shiny, and was used in the manger for Jesus to lay his head on. Around 1962, girls were told to squirt lemon juice on their hair to make it go blonde in the sun. My cousin Marie did this, and it seemed to have worked for her. Then, one day at school, I was in line going up the stairs, and the girl in front of me, who had lovely, thick, straight hair, seemed to me to have used this technique to give her hair a blonde streak. I told her I thought her hair was beautiful and that it looked like straw. She was angry with me and told everyone what I said, but no one understood what I had meant. For a lifetime, she hardly spoke to me again. So in poetry, I can say things in a different way that others will accept. The tradesmen came up to the cell and asked what colour I wanted the walls painted. I said white, and that was fine. The Barstow boys were sent over to do the job, and I asked would they paint the floorboards blue instead of covering the floor with brown oilcloth. That was customary. They finished both, and then the tradesmen came back with the brown oilcloth and told me they had to put it down. I argued that I didn't want the oilcloth. Then one of them said, so you won't mind the mice join you through the night from between the big gaps in the floorboards? I quickly agreed that the oilcloth should be put down immediately. They were finishing my cell when I was called for my first visit. My mother and father looked tired. I kissed and hugged them both under the ever watchful eye of the screw on the desk. They were used to prisons, as my both brothers had been interned in Long Kesh since 1971, and my father himself an ex-prisoner from the 40s. I had been arrested by the Fusiliers, and when I asked my mother what the house raid was like, she closed her eyes and said, worse than that time with Major Story. No further description was necessary, for I knew exactly what it must have been like. She was referring to a house raid the previous August by the Royal Artillery Regiment, who were based in our local GAA sports park. It was named after Sir Roger Casement, who was knighted by the British Parliament for his humanitarian work on their behalf in the Congo. He was also hanged by them for treason. The offence was shipping arms for the Easter Rising from Germany in 1916. Unfortunately, he was captured on the Bannostrand shore in Kerry. He was hanged the 3rd of August 1916 in Pentonville Prison, London. That night in our home, the Major was quite aggressive, pushing my mother down on the settee when she asked what they were looking for. We were all very shocked by his behaviour and began shouting at him. However, like all the raids in our home, nothing was found. The following day, we learned that he, Major Story, had been blown up by a claymore mine as he was walking across a field that is now a leisure centre on the Andersonstown Road. Everyone seemed to know his name, and when my mother heard of his death, she said, "Now, there's another grieving family. He was someone's son." I admired my mother for not saying anything nasty about him, given that he had assaulted her a short time before. The visit ended without tears. I kept them for later, as I'm sure my mother did. The smell of paint and the new oilcloth were nauseating inside the cell with the door locked an hour after I returned from my visit. It was supper time, consisting of a mean ham salad of sorts. My first parcel had arrived, and at last my clean clothes. Automatically, being a political prisoner, I got plenty of foodstuff in the parcel, which I received 3 times a week. The prison food was of good quality, but I was reluctant to eat it most days. I found the liver, for example, which I enjoyed outside, was always extremely hard, and the porridge always lumpy. The tea tasted bitter, but then I discovered that bromide was one of the ingredients in the prison tea. We made our own tea on the wing, and I became quite a tea drinker. The only problem being that it was often hard to get milk and sugar when needed, so I reluctantly became a black tea drinker without sugar. The key turned in the door and unlocked it. I did not rush, nor did anyone else, to leave their cell. Other girls would be finishing conversations with whomever they had taken their supper with. Generally, everyone seemed relaxed about time in prison. There never seemed to be a call to hurry things. Rush McCotter from Lenadoon was in the next cell to mine, and she knocked my door and asked if she could come in and invited me out for a walk in the yard. It was customary that everyone went for a walk after watching the 6 o'clock news downstairs in the small TV room. When Rush told me that bedtime lockup was at 8 p.m, I thought she was joking. I could not imagine how I would cope with such an early bedtime. At home, neighbours congregated in our house every night until around 2 a.m. There would be Hannah Morris and Eilish McGlinchey, Lizzie Lee and Mrs. Crean, who usually left first at around midnight. News of the past day would be discussed, sometimes singing and always storytelling. How would I survive without all that? Oh yes, and the tea and the toast. As Rush had said, a bell rang at 7:55 p.m. and everyone headed to their cell or whatever cell they would be spending the night in. The day ended as we all stood outside our cell, getting brought to attention in military fashion, and then, after the orders to dismiss, we would go inside the cell and the screws would walk along, locking each door. Some screws would say good night, others didn't. The key turning in the door was a lonely sound at first, but after a while you didn't always notice it. But then parties would begin, noticeably on parcel days. I had another good night's sleep and woke up with my idea of what to write on the walls. A new dawn had begun for me.
Thanks to Red and Roseleen for the invitation here today and the women holiday. Until they started speaking, I was thinking, where do Ballymurphy poems fit in today's event? It's about women prisoners, women ex-prisoners and their writings. But as I've listened and heard about Eileen Hickey and Roseleen's own experience, I've thought that if what happened during the Ballymurphy massacre had been handled differently at the time by the authorities, we might not have had the history that we're listening to now. Ballymurphy happened in August 1971 at internment, when people were slaughtered in the area. 6 months later, we had Bloody Sunday. And 5 months after that, there was the Spring Hill massacre where 5 people died. That sequence of events might not have happened. And I know it's easy to say this, but it's important to say it as well. If what happened in Ballymurphy had been treated as the murder that it was, really, I can find no other word to say. 50 years after those killings, I attended the inquest. Not as often as the families did, of course, but on occasions each week I went to the inquest. And sitting there listening to people hear soldiers speak, MOD members speak, people in charge at that time speak about what happened. And as I listened and listened to the families, some images stuck in my mind. And after the inquest were over and everyone was found entirely innocent, some of these images I couldn't get rid of, and I started to write some poems about them. And the result is this collection of Ballymurphy poems. The first half is about place and history to some extent. The places where people were killed and the places where we were all affected by internment. The second half is a set of poems about each individual person, and it relies largely on the accounts given by families to the court of inquest, where they wrote a statement about each member of the family. What I'll do today is I'll read some of these poems, some about place and some about the person who was killed in that place. But I'll start with a poem, the first poem in the collection called Internment. Whenever we were there, the military witnesses often referred to Operation Demetrius. And Operation Demetrius, I wondered, what was that about and why did they constantly refer to Operation Demetrius? But you'll find out in the poem why. The start of the poem has a little quote from James B. Burke, who wrote in the New York Times in 1983, Demetrius lives on in Ireland. And from his article is this. Some long forgotten military planner called it Operation Demetrius, in honour of the warrior king of Macedonia, who, it was said, conquered but never ruled. So now the poem. In Laganside Courthouse, courtroom 12, military witnesses often refer to Operation Demetrius. Families facing them look and listen. They have waited a long time to see and hear the men in charge tell what happened that day and why. Who ordered the shooting? In their evidence, the long-forgotten military planner is called to mind and forgotten in one and the same breath, much as the River Lagan is remembered in the courthouse, far from its ancient origins, Avon and Lagan, far as Ballymurphy is from Macedonia, where Demetrius made a name for himself. The next one is called White Rock Road. 1. Orders. The sapper driving a digger up the White Rock Road wears a red beret to look like the Paras in The Pig coming behind. They are all under orders to dismantle the barricades in West Belfast. It is day 2 of internment in Ballymurphy. 2. Search. 5 lives are lost. 1 family search for their father, last seen in the Mansfield. The place is on an uproar. Rumours are rife. Those who can get the children out. 1 man sends his wife and 4 kids away to stay somewhere in the country. 3. Shooting. She will return to the West a widow. After the shooting at the barricade, where the sapper opens fire, he is the only soldier at the inquest to say he killed a man, perhaps by accident. 4. Jury. The family in the jury box face a man who was a sapper in Belfast almost 50 years ago, driving a digger in a red beret, removing barricades, making way for Paras under orders, making widows and orphans in Ballymurphy. The man shot dead was Eddie Doherty, aged 31. He was the father of 4 children, and this is the poem for him. Eddie Doherty. Eddie was the 4th of 6 children. He and Marie had 4 themselves when the soldiers shot him. A pioneer, confraternity man, blood donor, and great worker. That was our Eddie. They said he was a petrol bomber after they killed him. In the paper, he was named as gunman Eamon Doherty, whose body was dumped on White Rock Road. All lies. May God forgive them. I don't. The bullet that killed Eddie wrecked us all. His wife and my mother died broken-hearted. The verdict is clear. My innocent brother Eddie was deprived of his life. So were we. Ballymurphy Road. On day 3, knowing the needs, the youth leader leaves the centre to give out milk in Ballymurphy. Some say, drawing on his Aidan experience, that he carried a Red Cross flag. He steps out and the flag, fired on, falls from his hand. He retreats to the centre. Later, undeterred, he goes out again. He is stopped in the street and assaulted by a foot patrol. A gun is put in his mouth. Click. Soldiers laugh. Later still, the man's heart gives out. The man killed there was Pat McCarthy, father of 3 children, and youth leader in the Ballymurphy Centre, Community Centre. This is the poem for him. Pat McCarthy. At the time of internment, Pat McCarthy was the youth leader in Ballymurphy. A former British soldier himself, he contacted the army base to ask for a ceasefire so that the children could be evacuated to safety. When that failed, he did what he could to help. So on the 3rd day of no deliveries, he stacked crates of milk on a trolley and went round the district giving it out. Mocked and molested for his bravery by paratroopers, his kind heart collapsed. Jan lost her love. His family in England lost a fearless father, son, and brother. I'd like to finish with a poem about Joan Connolly, the only woman who was killed during the Ballymurphy massacre. Joan Connolly, she was 44 and the mother of 8 children. She looked for us up the Henry Taggart. I caught sight of her before the tear gas. We asked about, but she didn't come home. My daddy put mattresses on the floor for us to be together without her. He used Mr. Herdman's phone that morning. Yes, a red-haired woman had been admitted. She was in the morgue. He came back broken. Some were sent south to his family. In a refugee camp, my sisters heard. Joan Connolly, mother of 8 children, was buried today. No one told us. We grieved first, then struggled to survive. Now we campaign. Justice for the innocent. Thank you.
Thanks so much, firstly to all the Learning staff for organising today, and to Red for inviting me to join the panel, and especially to all 3 of you for sharing such personal and moving and fascinating work. My research in history focuses on women's experiences of internment in an earlier period during the Second World War. So I suppose what I hope to do today is to just share some very brief insights from my research, which might point towards experiences that women in these 2 different periods have had in common, and hopefully that leads us into kind of broader questions in the Q&A. So generally speaking, as we've already heard so far today, male experiences of political imprisonment have received more attention in both scholarly works and in the broader public discourse. And of course this is changing, and all the work we've heard today is a great example of how that narrative is being broadened and how women's voices are continuing to be amplified. But I think when we come to the 1940s, the stories of the women that were interned on this island during the war years are perhaps even less well known. While my broader research considers the women that were held in Mountjoy in Dublin, and also women who were sentenced under special powers, today I'll just be focusing on the women that were held in Armagh between 1939 and 1945. So again, as we've heard today, activities that women were accused of being engaged in ranged from minor offences such as possession of banned publications. There's one case of 2 sisters arrested over a single copy of a newspaper, to more serious charges, including possession of ammunition and presence at the shooting of an IUC officer. Many of the women that were interned in the 1940s were teenagers, but some were older, married women, some had children. One woman was interned alongside her teenage daughter, and perhaps unusually for the 1940s, some of them had professional careers as well, teachers, nurses, and so on. So the disruption that internment had on their lives was of course significant, interrupting their careers, but also their family lives, their social lives. And so in my work, I tried to centre women's experiences, to focus on what the lived experience of imprisonment was like in Armagh in the 40s, so that we can try and better understand what those women's realities were. In terms of day-to-day life in the prison,
the women, of course, faced the familiar challenge of boredom. They sang, they played instruments where they could, they held services and memorials, and they kept themselves occupied in very similar ways, really, to how women who had been interned in the generations prior to them and the generations that followed did. Another key part of life in Armagh in the war years, probably unsurprisingly, was food. And they weren't allowed the same level of freedom to supplement their diets as women in Dublin were, but they did receive some parcels. And we've heard already about parcels and their importance earlier. The acting governor of Armagh in the 40s was Major Brush, and from the records it seems that he had an almost personal vendetta against confectionery parcels. At one point he described that the women were gorging themselves on parcels, and as a result they were refusing to eat their prison diet, their wholesome prison diet. And he claimed that they were actually throwing excess porridge down the latrines, and described, quote, evil-looking cakes, pastries, and every imaginable thing that were pouring into the prison from Dublin and elsewhere. And when trouble broke out in the summer of 1943, he went as far as blaming the trouble partially on excess sugar consumption. He said that it had corrupted and had an impact on the women's livers. And many of you will be familiar with McGuffin's work on internment, which was published in the early 70s. He actually interviewed several of the women who were interned in that period, and they described the food very differently as shocking, abominable, and, quote, they recall eating endless prunes and beans. So obviously that paints a very different picture to Major Brush's account. But I think what's really striking for me when we think about diet is the impact that the provision of parcels had on families. And this is, again, certainly not unique to prisoners in the 40s. But many of the women who were interned in Armagh during the war, they had brothers in the front, they had other male relatives who were interned. And there are accounts that outline just how difficult it was for families to provide for multiple prisoners. And this was made even more difficult under rationing. And again, Major Brush raised concerns that internees would be receiving items beyond their rationing quota, and he suggested that some of the food that was being sent into Armagh was being purchased on the black market and sent over the border from the south, where obviously the neutral state had different food regulations. And the Ministry of Food actually weighed in on the conversation and made it clear that there were no regulations against families sharing their rations, so prisoners could be sent rationed items. But again, what this points to for me is the sacrifice that families were making, even under rationing, to centre the needs of the prisoner. Very briefly then, another important aspect of life in Armagh in the 40s was the emergence of tensions and divisions between the women, particularly between a smaller group of women from Bury and other prisoners who were mainly from Belfast. And when trouble broke out in the prison in late August of 1943, women from the Belfast group had reportedly refused to return to their cells. The prison staff called in external IUC reinforcements, and they ended up turning the prison fire hose on the women to force the women back into their cells, soaking their cells and all their personal property. And then following that incident, the women were also strip searched. We have a lot less first-hand accounts of this incident than we do from later decades. But as I've mentioned, obviously McGuffin interviewed some of the women, and In the Footsteps of Áine, which has been discussed earlier, features testimony, and so does Adams and Macaulay's book, which came out last year. But of all these interviews, one internee's comment about the hosing stands out for me the most, and she said, "Many a time it keeps me awake thinking of how it happened, how and under God we survived it." To me, that really demonstrates the lasting impact that those types of incidents had on the women who lived through them. And there were also 2 hunger strikes in Armagh over the winter of 1943 to 1944. They were relatively brief. One lasted for 22 days and the second lasted only 3 days. The first and longest strike of the Belfast women, under the command of their OC Cassie O'Hara, did gain the women some minor concessions. But overall, the protests point to the women's unhappiness with their conditions, and in particular, they focused on how cold it was in Armagh in that winter. So, although I've just spoken very briefly about that period, I hope it offers some insights into what life was like in Armagh in the 1940s, and points to some themes which are common across the decades: the difficulties of day-to-day life, from things like boredom and complaints over food to much more serious and traumatic incidents, and also the idea that internment has an impact on an entire family and not just on the individual who's interned. Piecing together the details of life in the prison reveals a great deal about how a state chooses to treat political prisoners, and crucially, how that treatment can differ across borders, between genders, but perhaps most importantly for today, over the decades. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to that discussion. Thanks.